Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Human gets kicked out of engineering class for wrong math, ends up revolutionizing galactic physics. Ryan Porter had always known he was different. Back on Earth, he had been the kind of student who questioned everything, never satisfied with simply memorizing formulas without understanding their deeper implications. That trait had earned him both admiration and frustration from his professors, but here at the Galactic Engineering Academy, nestled within the orbital research station of the Xerian Empire, it had made him an outcast. The Academy prided itself on tradition. Thousands of alien species had passed through its halls, all adhering to the same core principles of energy physics, principles deemed absolute and unchangeable. Ryan, however, saw cracks in their logic. To him, equations were not sacred laws but evolving concepts, tools that could be refined and redefined. And that belief had led him to this moment, standing before Professor Zarak, a towering Xeran with 3 luminous eyes that pulsed in irritation. The examination hall was silent except for the faint hum of holographic projectors. Alien students of various species sat frozen in their seats, their gaze fixed on the unfolding spectacle. Ryan's answer sheet hovered in the air, the equations he had carefully written glowing in crisp blue light. The symbols, though foreign in script, carried universal mathematical meaning. And yet, according to Professor Zyra, they were all wrong. This, the professor's deep, resonant voice filled the hall, is nonsense. Ryan clenched his fists but forced himself to remain composed. I don't believe it is, sir, he said evenly. I can explain. Professor Zyrak's secondary eyes narrowed, a Xerian gesture of skepticism. The fundamental equation of matter-energy conversion has stood unchallenged for 70,000 years. It has been tested across every known physical environment, verified by countless generations of scholars, and you, a first-year human student, believe you have corrected it. Murmurs spread through the room. Ryan could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. He had known his calculations would be controversial, but he hadn't expected outright rejection before he even had a chance to defend them. Yes, sir, he said, standing his ground. I believe the current equation accounts for energy transfer only under static conditions. My revision includes an overlooked variable, momentum decay at quantum scales. When applied, it resolves discrepancies in high-energy interactions that your own models fail to explain. Silence followed. Professor Zyra's bioluminescent skin flickered, a sign of agitation. He turned to the class. Let us humor our human student, then. Porter, if your equation is correct, it should withstand an applied theoretical test. Ryan's pulse quickened as the professor gestured toward the hovering examination sheet. With a flick of his clawed fingers, he inserted Ryan's equation into the Academy's holographic simulator. Lines of mathematical computations formed in the air, complex multidimensional graphs mapping out theoretical energy interactions. For a moment, Ryan held his breath. If his equation truly worked, it would manifest in the simulation. The graphs flickered, the room tensed. Then the entire simulation collapsed in on itself, error codes flashing red. Laughter rippled through the hall. Ryan's stomach tightened as the professor's expression twisted into something that resembled smug satisfaction. As expected, Xerox said, dismissing the projection with a wave of his hand. Incorrect. You have ignored the foundational principles of energy equilibrium. But the simulation didn't prove my equation wrong, Ryan protested. It only failed because the current simulation model doesn't account for the variable I introduced. You are arrogant, Zyrox said coldly. Do you truly believe that you alone have seen what generations of minds have missed? Ryan took a breath, steadying himself. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. I don't think I'm the first to see it, he admitted. But I do think others dismissed it because they trusted the existing models too much. Professor Zyra stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over Ryan. Enough! You have wasted valuable time. I will not entertain further delusions. With a dismissive wave, the professor made his final declaration. You have failed this examination. Furthermore, I see no reason to allow you to continue in my course. Your presence disrupts the integrity of this institution's scientific rigor. Effective immediately, you are expelled from this program." Ryan's heart pounded. Expelled? He had expected a failing grade, maybe even some academic probation, but outright dismissal. His throat tightened as he looked around the room. None of the other students spoke up in his defense. Some averted their gazes, unwilling to involve themselves. Others seemed to revel in his humiliation. He turned back to Xerox, forcing himself to stay calm. "You're making a mistake." "No," the professor replied, his tone sharp. "You did." The finality of those words hit him harder than he expected. The examination sheet flickered and vanished. His student credentials would be revoked within the hour, his place in the academy. Ryan stood frozen for a moment, struggling to process the reality of what had just happened. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the hall. The doors slid shut behind him with a hollow hiss, sealing his fate. As he stepped into the vast corridors of the academy, his mind raced. He had lost everything he had worked for, but deep down, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't wrong, and he was going to prove it. Ryan walked through the long, arched corridors of the Galactic Engineering Academy, his footsteps echoing softly against the smooth, metallic floors. The illumination from the crystalline panels overhead cast a dim, sterile glow, reflecting off the polished walls lined with holographic plaques honoring past scholars. His name would never be among them. His dismissal had been swift, brutal, and final. His student credentials were already revoked, barring him from accessing academy resources or laboratories. The last few students who crossed his path barely spared him a glance, as if his presence no longer carried weight. He had ceased to exist in their world, but the fire inside him refused to die. He stormed into his quarters, a small, standard-issue room designed for off-world students. The moment the door sealed behind him, he activated his personal console and retrieved his equations. The numbers and symbols floated in the air before him, glowing faintly. He studied them, his mind dissecting each variable, each line of reasoning. He had run the calculations 100 times before submitting them. There was no mistake. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. His pulse still pounded from the confrontation with Xerox, the humiliation of being publicly ridiculed. He had been given no chance to argue, no room for debate. He had been erased. But if his work was truly as flawed as Xerox claimed, then why did it feel so right? Frustration gnawed at him. He needed confirmation, something beyond his own instincts. He couldn't test the equation within the Academy's systems anymore, but there had to be another way. His fingers moved quickly, pulling up archived research files from the Academy's public database. He sifted through dense reports, searching for anything that hinted at discrepancies in the accepted models. Hours passed. The projections from his console flickered as he scrolled through the vast sea of data. His eyes burned from strain, but he pressed on. He wasn't looking for agreement. He was looking for failure, for unexplained inconsistencies in the energy conversion models the Academy held sacred. And then, buried in an old research log nearly 3 centuries old, he found it. A report by an obscure Xerian physicist detailed an anomaly encountered during deep space energy transfer experiments. The findings suggested a deviation from the expected energy distribution, a fluctuation unaccounted for by the existing equation. The research had been classified as inconclusive. No follow-up had ever been conducted. Ryan's breath caught. This was it. He quickly ran the reported data through his own equation. The results matched perfectly. His formula accounted for the discrepancy, something the most advanced minds of the time had dismissed as irrelevant noise. His heart pounded in his chest. Had no one ever bothered to revisit this? Excitement surged through him, but it was laced with frustration. The evidence had been there all along, ignored simply because it didn't fit the accepted model. He scoured the database for more reports, cross-referencing his findings with other unexplained anomalies. The more he looked, the clearer it became. The current equation wasn't just incomplete, it was fundamentally flawed. He leaned back, exhaling deeply. This wasn't just about proving himself right anymore. The implications of his discovery stretched far beyond academic recognition. The entire field of energy physics was built on an equation that failed to explain real-world observations. If he could prove it, he wouldn't just be correcting a mistake. He would be rewriting the foundation of galactic science. But how? The Academy had shut him out. He had no access to its research labs or resources. Even if he published his findings, no one would take the word of an expelled student seriously. He needed something undeniable, something no one could dismiss. He needed an experiment. His mind raced through possibilities. He had no lab, no equipment, but he still had knowledge. There had to be a way to test the equation outside the Academy's influence. His gaze flickered to the far end of the room, where a compact device rested on his desk. It was a personal energy modulator, standard issue for all students. It wasn't powerful, but it was designed to simulate energy interactions on a small scale. If he could modify it, he might be able to create a controlled experiment that demonstrated the flaws in the accepted model. Determination set in. He grabbed the device and pulled up its internal schematics on his console. The modifications wouldn't be easy. He would need materials, components, things he no longer had access to. He would have to find another way. Ryan's mind drifted to the underbelly of the Academy, where discarded tech, old parts, and failed experiments were dumped. It wasn't a formal scrapyard, but it had served as an unofficial resource for students who needed extra components without filing requests. He stood abruptly, securing the energy modulator in his satchel. If he could gather the right components, he could build a prototype, something capable of running a real-world test of his equation. He was going to prove it, not to Zyra, not to the Academy, to the entire galaxy. Ryan moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridors beneath the Academy, his footsteps muffled by the low hum of the ventilation system. The lower levels had long been abandoned by most students, serving only as a dumping ground for outdated equipment and failed experiments. It was a place of forgotten potential, a graveyard of innovation that no longer fit within the Academy's rigid framework. To him, it was an opportunity. He adjusted the strap of his satchel, feeling the weight of the energy modulator inside. He had spent hours analyzing its internal systems, determining exactly what modifications he needed to make. Now he had to find the missing components, materials that could handle the energy fluctuations his equation predicted. The walls around him were lined with rows of old storage units, their locking mechanisms either broken or overridden long ago by other students scavenging for spare parts. He moved between them carefully, scanning the labels on discarded devices. Most of them were useless, defective plasma regulators, fractured quantum conduits. But then he spotted something promising. A decommissioned resonance stabilizer lay atop a pile of rusting components. He pulled it free, wiping away a layer of dust. The device had been used in early attempts at zero-point energy conversion, but it had been abandoned due to instability. That instability, however, was exactly what he needed. If his equation was correct, his modifications would compensate for the fluctuations and create a stable energy field, something no existing model could achieve. He set the stabilizer aside and continued his search. A power capacitor from an old Zalarian research drone, a thermal insulator from a failed deep space probe. Each piece he found brought him one step closer. As he worked, his mind raced through the calculations, adjusting for the variables he hadn't yet accounted for. By the time he had gathered everything, hours had passed. He retreated to the small, hidden workspace he had claimed for himself in a forgotten maintenance tunnel near the outskirts of the Academy's main research wing. The space was cramped, barely large enough for him to move around, but it was secure. No one ever came down here. He laid out the components on the metal workbench, his hands steady despite the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. The modifications required precision. One miscalculation and the entire device could overload, possibly destroying everything in the vicinity, including himself. But hesitation wasn't an option. He began by dismantling the energy modulator, carefully integrating the resonance stabilizer into its core system. The original design of the modulator was meant for controlled, low-level energy manipulation, but he was pushing it beyond its intended limits. He rerouted power through the capacitor, adjusting the flow to match the theoretical values his equation predicted. The thermal insulator would prevent overheating, but the real challenge was balancing the energy conversion in real time. Minutes turned into hours. Sweat lined his brow as he fine-tuned the connections, double-checking each calculation against the physical adjustments he made. At several points, the device emitted warning signals, its systems detecting anomalies it wasn't programmed to handle. He manually bypassed the safeguards, trusting his equation more than the technology designed to enforce outdated principles. Finally, he stepped back, exhaling slowly. The modified energy modulator rested on the workbench, its core humming with a low, steady vibration. It was stable for now. The real test would come when he activated it. He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the weight of what he was about to do. If his equation worked, it wouldn't just be an academic achievement. It would prove that the fundamental understanding of energy physics, the very foundation the Academy was built on, was incomplete. The implications stretched far beyond the classroom. He reached for the activation switch. The moment he pressed it, the device came to life. A soft glow radiated from its center, illuminating the dark space with a shifting spectrum of colors. He adjusted the output, slowly increasing the energy levels. Then the anomaly appeared. A distortion formed in the air above the device, a ripple in space itself. It wasn't a malfunction, it was proof. His equation had predicted this exact effect, an energy fluctuation that the traditional model failed to account for. But now it wasn't just theoretical, it was real. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He had done it. Before he could react further, a sharp sound echoed through the tunnel, a metallic clang followed by approaching footsteps. Someone was coming. His pulse spiked. If he was caught here with this device, the consequences would be far worse than expulsion. He had to move. With one last glance at the shimmering distortion above the modulator, he shut the device down and gathered his things. The experiment had worked, but he wasn't safe yet. He had proof now. He had to figure out what to do with it. Ryan barely had time to power down the modulator before the footsteps drew closer. His mind raced as he shut off the glowing control panel, stuffing the device into his satchel. The shimmering distortion above the device faded just as the metal hatch at the end of the tunnel groaned open. Light spilled into the narrow space, momentarily blinding him. A figure stepped through, Instructor Lewin. The Xerian scientist had never been one of Ryan's professors, but he recognized him from several research seminars, always a silent observer, never the kind to challenge authority. But now his three luminous eyes fixed on Ryan with piercing intensity, his long fingers hovering near the console embedded in his wrist, a security override command ready to be issued at a moment's notice. Ryan's pulse hammered in his ears. If Luther reported him, this wouldn't be an expulsion. This would be a tribunal hearing before the Galactic Science Council, unauthorized experimentation with energy physics, tampering with Academy property, and worst of all, attempting to challenge a scientific principle deemed absolute. The consequences wouldn't just mean exile from the Academy. He could be blacklisted from every scientific institution in the Empire. Lewin didn't speak immediately. His gaze flickered toward the workbench, where the faint heat signature of Ryan's experiment still lingered in the air. The instructor stepped further into the cramped space, the door sliding shut behind him with a quiet hiss. Ryan forced himself to stay calm. His best chance was to convince Lewin that he hadn't actually done anything worth reporting. But lying to a Xerian was nearly impossible. Their species had a heightened sensitivity to vocal stress patterns, making deception a fool's errand. "I thought I heard something down here," Lewin finally said, his voice measured. "I was expecting to find a malfunctioning conduit. Instead, I find you." Ryan didn't respond. Any words he said would only dig him deeper. Lewin's secondary eyes scanned the workbench, his expression unreadable. "You've modified an energy modulator. Impressive, considering the limitations of its original design. But that's not all, is it?" He took another step forward, lowering his voice. "What were you testing, Porter?" Ryan exhaled. He had two choices: deny everything and hope Luthen lost interest, or tell the truth and risk everything. He made his decision. "I was testing an equation," Ryan said, his voice steady though his heart pounded in his chest. "An equation that corrects the fundamental laws of energy physics." Lewin didn't react at first. His fingers twitched slightly, but he remained silent, his three eyes locked onto Ryan's. The moment stretched into an eternity. Then, to Ryan's surprise, the instructor let out a quiet sigh. "You are either incredibly arrogant or dangerously perceptive." Ryan frowned. "You don't sound surprised." Lewin regarded him for a long moment before finally speaking again. "You aren't the first to notice the inconsistencies in the traditional model," he admitted. "There have been whispers, isolated findings buried in research archives, anomalies dismissed as calculation errors, but no one has dared to challenge it outright. Until you." Ryan's grip on his satchel tightened. "So you know I'm right." Lewin exhaled sharply. "Knowing and proving are two very different things, Porter. You have no credibility, no institutional backing. Even if your equation is correct, the Academy will never acknowledge it, not unless you present irrefutable public proof." Ryan felt frustration clawing at him. "I have proof. I ran an experiment. The results match my equation." "Results that were conducted in a hidden tunnel using unauthorized equipment," Luth countered. "Do you think that will be enough? The moment you reveal your findings, the Academy will bury you. Your data will be dismissed as falsified. Your career will be over before it begins." Ryan clenched his jaw. He knew Lewin was right. The Academy wasn't a place that welcomed change. It was a place that preserved power. And yet Lewin hadn't turned him in. He was still standing here, still listening. Ryan took a step forward. "You said others have noticed the same inconsistencies. Who? Where are they?" Lewin hesitated. "Most are long gone. Some were expelled, others left of their own accord, realizing that staying meant silencing themselves." A chill ran down Ryan's spine. How many voices had been erased before his? How many discoveries had been buried beneath tradition? "Where did they go?" Ryan asked. Lewin's eyes flickered toward the sealed door, as if checking for unseen listeners. "Some disappeared into independent research collectives, others sought refuge in the outer colonies, where imperial influence is weaker." He paused. "But there is one who might still be willing to listen." Ryan leaned in. "Who?" Lewin's voice dropped lower. "Dr. Elleris V." Ryan's breath caught. He knew the name. Everyone did. V had once been the most promising physicist in the Empire until he vanished nearly a decade ago. Official reports claimed he had retired after an irreconcilable disagreement with the Academy, but rumors suggested something else, that he had discovered something the Empire didn't want made public. Ryan's mind raced. If anyone could help him prove his findings, it was Vec. Lewin straightened. "I've said too much already. If anyone asks, I was never here." He turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. "If you go after V, be careful. The people who forced him into exile won't hesitate to do the same to you." Ryan nodded, his resolve hardening. He had a name, a lead, and now he had a mission. He wasn't just going to prove his equation, he was going to expose the truth. Ryan had never left the Academy grounds without permission, but that no longer mattered. His name had already been erased from the records, his student credentials revoked. There was no reason for him to stay in a place that had turned its back on the truth. Lewin's words echoed in his mind as he made his way toward the docking bay. Dr. Ali's V. If there was even a chance that V had discovered the same inconsistencies, Ryan had to find him. He didn't know where to start, but he wasn't entirely helpless. The professor's disappearance had been abrupt, but there were whispers of sightings, fragments of information buried in old research networks. He slipped into a maintenance corridor, avoiding the main security checkpoints. Without his credentials, the Academy's transport systems were locked to him, but he had prepared for that. During his late-night research sessions, he had uncovered an emergency access panel near the docking bay, an old override system designed for maintenance crews in case of a power failure. Reaching the panel, he took a deep breath and pulled the cover off. The inner wiring was ancient by Academy standards, but the override sequence was simple. He rerouted the power flow, forcing the system into diagnostic mode. The docking bay doors flickered as the system reset, granting him a small window of opportunity. He didn't waste time. The transport shuttle was a standard cargo vessel, its pilot likely an off-worlder who didn't care about Academy politics. Ryan boarded quickly, keeping his head down as he slipped into one of the passenger seats at the back. The ship rumbled as the engines powered up, and moments later, the Academy station shrank into the darkness behind him. The journey took him to the outer colonies, a sector of space far from the Empire's rigid control. If Vec was hiding anywhere, it would be here. Ryan spent hours combing through underground research networks, searching for anything that could lead him to the exiled scientist. The name surfaced in encrypted messages, referenced in obscure scientific forums where dissident thinkers discussed ideas deemed too dangerous for mainstream academia. Eventually, he found what he was looking for, a set of coordinates embedded in a heavily secured data log. The location pointed to an isolated research station orbiting a dying star. It was a place few dared to visit, surrounded by unstable gravitational anomalies. But Ryan didn't hesitate. He booked passage on a freelancer's ship, trading the last of his credits for transport. As the vessel approached the station, Ryan could see its deteriorating state. The structure was old, its external plating scorched from years of exposure to solar radiation. It wasn't a place built for comfort. It was a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. The docking bay barely functioned, but the ship's pilot managed to land. Ryan stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, his breath shallow. The air smelled of old machinery and recycled oxygen. He moved cautiously, unsure of what kind of reception to expect. Then a voice cut through the silence. "You're either very brave or very stupid to come here, boy." Ryan turned sharply. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, leaning against a rusted console. Dr. Elleris V. His once pristine academic robes were long gone, replaced by a worn-out jumpsuit stained with grease and dust. His eyes, however, were sharp, scanning Ryan with unsettling intensity. "I need your help," Ryan said. V snorted. "Everyone who finds me says that." Ryan didn't back down. "I have an equation, one that proves the fundamental laws of energy physics are wrong." That caught V's attention. His posture shifted slightly, his fingers twitching as if itching to pull up a holographic display. "Show me," he said. Ryan wasted no time. He pulled out his personal console, projecting his findings into the air between them. He explained his modifications, the experiment, the anomaly he had created. V watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When Ryan finished, V let out a slow breath. "You actually did it," he muttered. Ryan's pulse quickened. "Then you knew." "I had my suspicions," V admitted. "I spent years trying to correct the equation myself, but I was always missing something.